This is the Free Your Mind and the Rest Will Follow by Nikki Nicholson Klingerman. So when I do this for my students, I like to start with a pain acknowledgement. No one owns this land. Historically, many indigenous tribes like Klamath, Pendleton, Multnomah, Chinook, and Clatsop lived here. Some of us were forcibly brought over through the transatlantic slave trade, while others escaped atrocities to be here. We acknowledge and never forget what has led us all to being here today. This is the community agreements. Listen to others when they share, respect, find out what that means to each person, safe space, nothing leaves this class without consent. This is the writing prompt I use for my students. What is your day of Thanksgiving, a day that you are most grateful for? And this is the bulk of the lesson plan. We'll just get right into it. Trigger warning, there will be some mention of genocide, and this is called The Origins of Thanksgiving. So the main narrative around Thanksgiving surrounds a feast in 1621 when the Native American Wampanoag people, I apologize if I do mispronounce some of these words, the Wampanoag people and the English colonists in Plymouth, Massachusetts broke bread together. Although this is technically a true event, it was actually not meant to be the origin of the holiday we now know as Thanksgiving. For one, it was just a harvest celebration, and the word Thanksgiving actually was never used. And for another, only years later, those same colonists killed thousands of the Wampanoag tribe after breaking their Treaty of Unity. In 1637, the English Puritans who had settled in Mystic, Connecticut and came into conflict with nearby tribes, including the Pequot tribe. The Pequot tribe lived in two forts. One fort were mainly able bodied men, and the other were primarily women, children, and elders. In the summer of 1637, not only were the women, children, and elders not spared, the Puritan leader, John Mason, specifically targeted the latter fort. Slaughter ensued, and the soldiers set fire to the structures and burned the remaining people alive. So I'm about to read an excerpt from John Mason's journal from that time period. It has been abridged, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the first person account of what happened that day. We had formerly concluded to destroy them by the sword and save the plunder, but the captain said, "We must burn them." And immediately stepping into the wigwam where he had been before, brought out a firebrand and, putting it into the mats with which they were covered, set the wigwams on fire. When it was thoroughly kindled, the Indians ran. And indeed, such a dreadful terror did the Almighty let befall their spirits, that they would fly from us and run into the very flames, where many of them perished. The fire was kindled on the northeast side to windward, which swiftly overrun the fort, to the extreme amazement of the enemy and great rejoicing of ourselves. And thus, in little more than 1 hour's space, was their impregnable fort utterly destroyed, along with the number of 600 or 700 Pequots. And thereupon grew many difficulties, our provision and munition near spent, we in enemy's country who did far exceed us in number, being much enraged, all of our Indians except the Oncos deserting us. So as you can see, they did have some allies, but most of them, after seeing how they killed women and children, and this spread all across during that time, they were amazed at how severe the English treated their enemies, and those who did stay in contact with the Puritans only stayed in contact out of fear for what would happen to themselves. Continuing on with this same event, John Winthrop, the governor of the state of Massachusetts, mentioned this event in his journal on June 15th, 1637. There was a day of thanksgiving in all the churches for the victories obtained against the Pequots and for other mercies. Another day was also declared in October for more victories against the Pequot. The Puritans continued to destroy the Pequots' remaining homes and food supplies until eventually they were forced to leave their homelands. And this is also an excerpt from John Winthrop's journal. Um, it's been heavily abridged, but should still give you a good idea of what happened that day. And this is a second-hand account of that event. The Our English from Connecticut, with many of the Narragansett tribe, I do apologize for any mispronunciations, marched in the night to the fort of the Pequots at Mystic, and after 2 hours' fight, they took it by firing it and slew therein 2 chiefs, 150 fighting men, and about 150 old men, women, and children. Many of the Indian friends were hurt by the English because they had not some mark to distinguish them from the Pequots. 3 days after, Mr. Williams, having gone to the Narragansett tribe, found them in mourning. Upon the news from Mr. Williams that the Pequots were dispersed and that all the Pequots had fled and forsaken their forts, there was a day of thanksgiving kept in all the churches for the victory obtained against the Pequot and for other mercies. So as you can see, many of the details line up with some differentiation. The number of how many were slain, there is some difference, but also, the fact that the indigenous tribes who were allied with the Puritans were hurt in the conflict and abandoned their original allies, their original friendship or treaty with the Puritans. I think this only mentions the Narragansett tribe, not the Unco tribe, so I'm not exactly sure why they stayed in contact, but might be something to look into. So the next day of Thanksgiving was actually ordered by George Washington, or I should say the next major one that I'm going to cover. There actually were many days of Thanksgiving called after major events, just like with what happened after the Pequot Massacre. In 1789, George Washington declared a day of Thanksgiving for the ratification of the United States Constitution. Many of his successors, like John Adams and James Madison, also declared similar days of Thanksgiving during the presidential terms. However, these were special days of Thanksgiving. They did not stick as yearly or national events. Sarah Josepha Hale, she was the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book periodical. She wrote editorials and lobbied through a letter writing campaign to members of Congress and other government officials to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. She actually is the one who used the 1621 feast as a cute anecdote to sell her vision, which is how it actually became so ubiquitous with the Thanksgiving story we know today. Thanksgiving actually wasn't her only influence as well. However, thanks to her editorials, women wear white on their wedding day, and we decorate Christmas trees in our homes. She's also credited for the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. I think it's very interesting that I've never heard of her until I did this research, and she had such an impact on our culture today. While, I definitely uh, take offense for her using that feast, that harvest feast, to kind of sell her vision. She still, through her writing and her editorial, she still has such a huge influence. And as a woman, that is very rare, especially back then in the 1800s. And she gets very little credit despite really influencing our culture. Because of her letter writing campaign, one of her letters actually ended up on Abraham Lincoln's desk. So in October 1863, Lincoln issued the Thanksgiving Proclamation after victory over the Confederacy. He was influenced by her letter, which arrived on his desk just months after the Battle of Gettysburg. Like all the other special days of Thanksgiving, he had a specific reason, and that's the end of slavery and victory over the Confederacy. What makes his proclamation different is what stuck. The last, uh, oh yeah, okay, so I did. So I was planning to cut this, but another change did occur when President Roosevelt switched Thanksgiving to the second Thursday of November in 1939. However, we actually have gone back to how Abraham Lincoln originally put it, which is the last Thursday in November. But I still think it's pretty cool that there's been many changes and influences in how we celebrate Thanksgiving. I also want to read a little bit from his proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. Um, you know, a lot of times we think of Thanksgiving as either that feast in 1621 or the Pequot Massacre. And all of it is violence against Indigenous folk. But I have never heard that the day of Thanksgiving was really because of the end of slavery, because of what had happened to my people. I mean, technically, I am Afro Indigenous, but I mainly identify as Black. So I really want to highlight that aspect of Thanksgiving because while I really I dislike the idea that Thanksgiving was a day of unity between Indigenous folk and white people, I would rather think of Thanksgiving as a day um, to celebrate the victory over slavery and victory over racism in the South. But to continue on, here is an excerpt. It's definitely abridged. In the midst of the civil war of unequal magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and provoke their aggressions, peace has been preserved with all nations. Order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere. Rejoicing is permitted with a large increase of freedom. It has seemed fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and one voice by the whole American people. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving. So, for my class, I had them read the entirety of John Mason's and John Winthrop's journal entries, as well as President Lincoln's Thanksgiving Proclamation. You can answer, I had them answer these questions in paragraph form. As you can see, I like to have them underline and highlight everything that resonates with them and put brackets around what doesn't. And then I have them answer these questions. The first question in John Mason's entry: how did the Puritans view their actions? How did their Indigenous allies eventually view their actions? And how do you view their actions? In John Winthrop's general entry: what happened to the Puritans' allies during the conflict? And what does President Lincoln declare as the reason and need for a unified National Day of Thanksgiving? And again, I just want to leave everyone with the idea that yes, it is horrendous what has happened to Indigenous tribes in America, and how the colonists came in. They were technically invaders, or even if you want to call them guests, they didn't respect the people who were already here. They acted viciously, aggressively, They killed women, children, and elders, people who were unarmed. And that is seen as, that is dishonorable. It's not, there's this idea that the colonists, were just freeing religious, um, oppression, but honestly, they really were just seeing free land, and they weren't seeing the people who were already here as humans. Um, and that's why we have, on Thanksgiving, or we want to call this, Indigenous Day of Recognition. Um, and that is definitely something I stand for. But I also want to go back to the origin of why Abraham Lincoln even wanted to do this. While Sarah Josepha Hale's editorials and uh, vision has created this myth of Thanksgiving, he took that and was like, let's do a day of Thanksgiving for unifying the Union back and for victory over the Confederacy. The Confederacy was advocating for the continuance of slavery, and that just obviously wasn't something that needed to continue. And because it didn't, because there was victory over them, we now have this holiday. We have this day of Thanksgiving. And as much as I disagree with that myth, I do always want to be thankful for the end of slavery, for the end of the Civil War, for the end of the Confederacy. That wasn't something that ever needed to happen. Obviously, at the same time, did the Union really need to happen? But we're here now and we're no longer enslaved. And I hope that we can take this time to be thankful for the end of slavery, but also remember the atrocities that's happened to Indigenous folk in this country, and try not to be, sucked into that myth of, oh, they all sat down, ate, and broke bread together. And because, yeah, technically that did happen one time, but all the other times ended in atrocity, ended in violence, ended in treating people as if they were less than human. And that's not okay. But I hope that enlightened you with some of the um, different origins of Thanksgiving. And hopefully, no matter what, you have a great time with your family, eat great food, and just be thankful for how we got here while also acknowledging the pain that brought us here. Thank you.